Hello, I'm Tammy Marshall, and today I'm going to share with you chapter four of my very first novel, a book I wrote quite a long time ago, but that's still fairly popular. And chapter four is actually, I'd say, kind of one of my favorite chapters in this book. And this is again about a young artist from Omaha who has inherited an old rural house in Clearwater, Nebraska from a woman she's never heard of before. So, if you haven't had a chance yet to listen to the first few chapters, you might want to go back and do that. But thanks for being with me here. Chapter 4. A thunderclap awoke her early Saturday morning, and Lillian looked out the motel room window to see the beginning of a downpour. So much for getting out and really exploring the place on foot, she grumbled. She hadn't brought proper clothing for traipsing through mud or being out in the rain too long. Lillian paid for her night and reserved the room for that night also, so she could leave some things there. Then she found a general store and bought a few candles, matches, lots of mousetraps, a large thermos, a cooler, rags, and sponges. After that, she stopped at the local grocery store and stocked up on fruit, sandwich makings, diet soda, bottled water, and ice. When she arrived at the house, she unloaded all that she'd bought as quickly as possible to avoid getting drenched. She returned to the car where she carefully wrapped her canvases and carried them inside, followed by a drop cloth, painter's stool, and palette. Since it was still raining and there was no sign it would cease any time soon, she looked around for the best place to paint. She decided on the upstairs south bedrooms, as the light was best there, especially on a dreary, rainy day. She would start in the front one and move to the back one as the afternoon wore on. First, she set up her work before the front window, and then she began to mix her paints into the desired shades. After applying a few strokes, she became bored with her current floral painting. She was disappointed in herself, since she knew it was almost complete, and she just wanted to finish it. Hoping that the solitude would yet prove to be inspiring, she continued to paint, but her muse wasn't with her. Giving up, she sat down on the floor with a sigh. Crossing her legs, she put her elbows upon them and rested her chin in her hands. She stared long and hard at her painting, but found her gaze continually shifting to the window. Finally, she stood and looked with concentration at the window and beyond. Suddenly, struck by something only she could sense, she moved to replace her painting with a fresh canvas and, as if in a trance, began working, keeping her eyes locked firmly upon the window, lost in what she was doing. Oblivious to the room and unaware that the light had faded as the sun passed over the house, the window held her attention captive while her right hand deftly sketched what only her mind could see. Slowly, she became aware of a repetitive noise, which released her from her daze. Raising her left hand, she rubbed her forehead in a futile attempt to soothe the throbbing behind her eyes. Then she heard the noise again, but she still couldn't put her finger on what it was until she heard a faint voice calling, "Is anyone here?" Fully alert now, she realized someone was at the front door. Glancing quickly at the canvas, she was amazed to see a half completed picture of the very window she'd been staring at only a few moments before. Now, why would I paint that window? She asked herself. Heading to the stairway, she noticed that the sunlight was now coming through the back bedroom window. She stopped and glanced at her watch. 2 o'clock? She gasped. How was that possible? She knew she'd begun painting around 10 o'clock. Stepping to the window, she looked out and saw that the rain had subsided. When did that happen? She wondered aloud. Her stomach growled from hunger as she hurried down the stairs. Through the window in the front door, she could see the back of a man as he began to move away, so she opened the door. He turned to look at her. Removing his well worn cap, he nodded in greeting. "Hello there. I was beginning to think no one was here." Lillian smiled and said, "Oh, no, I was upstairs painting." "Oh, so you are the new owner. Fixing it up already, huh?" "Oh, no," she chuckled. Not that kind of painting. I'm an artist. I was painting a picture. He stepped up onto the porch. Let me introduce myself. I'm Jake Edwards. My father and I farm and have a milking operation across the road. He offered his hand and she shook it. He had a warm grasp, and as he smiled at her, she noticed that he had a natural warmth about him. His green eyes sparkled, and permanent laugh lines were etched into his face. Nice to meet you, she replied, releasing his hand. I'm Lillian Chase. So, are you moving in? He peered over her shoulder at the bare interior of the house. No, I'm just checking the place out over the weekend. It's been left to me by some woman named Dorothy Meyer. Oh, yeah? I know Dorothy. She's a great old lady. Looking down at the cap he was twisting in his hands, he added, I didn't know she had died. Sorry to hear that. Noticing the sorrowful tone of his voice, Lillian was quick to reassure him. Oh no, she isn't dead. Jake looked up at her and his eyebrows slightly raised. That's good to hear. He waited a moment, but sensing that she wasn't going to provide any more information, he asked, Is she your grandmother? Oh no, I don't even know the woman, she said with a light chuckle. Then she laughed out loud at the confusion she saw on his face. I know just how you feel. I don't understand it either. Suddenly she had a thought. Why don't you come in and I'll tell you what I know, and you can tell me about this mystery woman, Dorothy Meyer. Jake followed Lillian into the house and looked around. You know, I've lived across from this house most of my life, but I've never been in it before. Lillian was ahead of him in the kitchen, taking a long drink of water from a bottle she bought earlier. Lowering the bottle, she said, Really? Didn't Dorothy live here? He walked into the room, filling up the doorway so much that he had to duck his head slightly. No, he responded. Dorothy was the town librarian. She lived in a little house near my church, for as far back as I can remember. Does she still live there? Lillian asked hopefully. No. A few years ago, she moved into a retirement apartment in Norfolk. He leaned against the dirty countertop, oblivious to the mouse droppings littering it. She made a mental note to check into the retirement complexes in Norfolk. It wasn't a large town, so there couldn't be many of them. Then she asked, So, has this place been vacant as far back as you can remember, also? He smiled at her, and she returned his smile as she offered him an apple. He took it and began to rub it on his shirt sleeve. No, an elderly couple lived here for about 15 years, but my folks never bothered to get to know them well. Dorothy hired them to take care of the place, but they weren't very sociable neighbors. The two of them walked onto the back porch and sat down on the top step. Eating the apples consumed their attention for a brief time until Lillian asked, Why didn't Dorothy sell the place if she wasn't going to live here? Jake shrugged his shoulders. I don't really know. I heard once that an old lover who had died left her the house and the property, and she couldn't bring herself to part with it. He paused and thought for a moment. But I don't know if that's true or not. You know how people talk. It's hard to imagine the elderly having past love lives. And to me, Dorothy was always an old woman. She ran the library until she was in her 80s, and then she couldn't keep away from it for more than a few days. She'd be in there volunteering her expertise and helping a child to find just the right book to take home for the week. He stopped and coughed lightly as he felt Lillian's eyes upon him. You must have thought a lot of her, she said. Jake nodded. Everyone did. You couldn't say a bad word about her in town without getting a whooping later for it. Lillian smiled. I'd like to meet this amazing woman. You really don't know her? Jake asked wonderingly. No, I'd never heard of her until 2 days ago. Pretty weird, isn't it? There's got to be some legitimate reason for her leaving you this place, Jake said as he threw his apple core far out into the weeds by the garage. I'm sure there is. That's part of the reason I came up here. I want to find out more about this woman and see what the connection is between her and me. She certainly didn't just pick my name out of the phone book. Jake nodded toward her car. I see by the license plate that that wouldn't be a local phone book now, would it? Omaha, is it? Yes, she answered. You have family there? She glanced at his face to see if he were perhaps asking more than he appeared to be asking, but he was simply looking at the tree line and didn't seem particularly interested in her. Hiding her disappointment, she replied, No, I'm single. In fact, I'm pretty much without family. Now he was looking closely at her. My parents died when I was in college. Despite the passage of many years, she still felt a catch in her throat as she said those words. I'm sorry I brought it up. She smiled weakly. It's okay. I was an only child, of an only child mother, and a father who'd been disowned by his family. Aside from my grandfather, it's just me. Wow, that must be hard sometimes. Only at Christmas and every other holiday. She gazed off into space, remembering her parents. Their faces seemed to blend with the trees behind the garage, and before tears could come, she shook her head softly, blinked hard, and turned to him. What about you? Do you have a large family? Oh, yeah, he grinned. I'm practically related to everyone around these parts. Are you married? As soon as she'd asked it, she wanted to shove her fist in her mouth. Divorced, he answered with just a touch of bitterness in his voice. That's why I'm living with my father again. My wife and I lived in town, and I came out to farm and do chores, but after she left me, I decided to move back out here. My son lives with me too. It was his turn to look at her casually, checking her response. The surprised reaction he'd expected wasn't there. Instead, she seemed to be waiting for him to finish what he was saying, so he continued. His name is Sam. He's 6, and most people say he's the spitting image of me. Do you think he is? Jake paused and then grinned mischievously. Well, I think he's the handsomest boy in the world, so yes, I'd have to say he does take after me. She laughed and suddenly realized how comfortable she felt with this man who had been a stranger to her but an hour ago. He stood up, cutting her laughter short. I suppose I'd better get back to work. I've got a fence to fix before I can let the cows into the holding pen tonight. A couple of them bolted this morning and tore down a section of it. Disappointed that he had to leave so soon, yet eager to return to that odd painting she'd begun, Lillian stood with him. She held out her hand. It was nice to meet you, Jake. Same here, he replied. He clasped her hand firmly in his, and then he blurted, Would you like to come over for supper? Realizing he still held her hand in his, he dropped it and waited expectantly for her answer. She hesitated only a fraction of a second before answering, Yes, I'd love to, but I didn't bring a change of clothes with me from the hotel. You look fine. It'll be real casual. His eyes swept over her jeans clad figure, and she blushed at the approving gleam in his eyes. Okay, what time should I come over, and where exactly is your house? I'll pick you up, he assured her. How does 7 o'clock sound? I can be done milking and cleaned up by then if I hurry. Don't rush on my account. 7:30 or even later is good for me, and I'd really prefer to walk over if it's not too far. No, just turn right at the end of your lane here, and we're the first place on your left before you even reach the next road. Walking with him around to the front of the house, she said, I'll be over around 7:30 then. He stepped into his pickup and placed his cap back onto his head. Pulling it low on his forehead, he nodded at her and started the vehicle. As he swung around, she saw his left hand shoot up from the window, and he gave a quick departing wave before disappearing around the bend in the driveway. Lillian smiled and returned his wave before twirling girlishly and going back into the house. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, she hurried into the front bedroom. Gazing out the window, she could still see some of the dust that had been stirred up by the pickup's tires. It was suspended momentarily in the air, and then it floated back to earth. Turning away from the window, she faced her painting. It was an interior view of that very bedroom window, only it seemed to be of an earlier era. The paint wasn't peeled, and there was a thin lace curtain which covered the right side of the window, but was held back on the left side. Looking more closely, she could see the beginning of something forming outside the window. Leaning back, she asked herself, why don't I remember painting any of this? As she looked intently at the spot outside the window on the canvas, she detected movement in the vague shape. Rather than being frightened, she gathered up her supplies and began to paint, once again, oblivious to her surroundings. The day wore on, and it soon became impossible for her to clearly see the canvas. Her conscious self began to regain control, forcing her subconscious self to cease its work. Stepping back, she squinted at the painting, but found that the room had grown too dark for her to adequately see what was on the canvas. She stepped into the back bedroom and held her watch up to the fading light at the window. It was already 7:15. She'd be late if she didn't hurry. With her strange painting behavior of the day momentarily forgotten in her desire to get to know Jake better, and with the overwhelming hunger she felt, Lillian rushed down the stairs and out to her car. She found a comb in her purse and ran it through her hair while she checked her appearance in the rearview mirror. Satisfied that she looked the best she could at the moment, she stepped out of the car and began walking to Jake's house.